Hello, thank you so much, Ron. Yeah, it's good to be back here. Like it's so funny that she opens up this book with the Henry Louis Gates Jr. Black and Latin America like segment that she talks about. I used to work on that show. That was like my first research job was on that show. It wasn't that one. It was like the Finding Your Roots, the ones where they would take celebrities and stuff like that.
Oh,
And I used
okay.
to be an intern on that show. And it's interesting that she says he doesn't take it there. He doesn't in the interview process with the gentleman at the museum, he doesn't take it there. He doesn't ask like tough questions about race and about identity. And that I remember that being true on the show. Like we would find really interesting things about people. And he wouldn't ask it if it was too Skip Gates. He wouldn't ask the question if it was too, or if it was just a little too provocative, or if the guest would be embarrassed by it. Some things we ran by people, which is I would never do that. Now in my work, I would never do that. Like for example, Ben Affleck's family, like we found out that his family owned slaves. And they ran it by him in like the secret email. And he was like, no, don't put that out.
Yeah.
We're going to run with the bit that my mom was like a freedom fighter, like on a bus or something. And then like a disgruntled intern, like leaked that email to the press. And it was like a big thing. But that's how he was on that show. That's really how that show was kind of based. It was really like, don't take it too far. Let's just, get through it. So I did find it interesting that she kind of felt that same way too. But, to start it off, I actually just kind of wanted to ask anyone if you wanted to jump in and maybe tell a brief story about maybe how you became Latina or Latino. Ron, I know your family is originally from Honduras. Does anyone have any anecdotes or memories that they could share that kind of to start us off?
I mean, I will jump in and just say the notion of becoming Latina, I don't really think about it because I never wasn't not Latina, but then again, I was born, in the Dominican Republic. So, and I grew up in this area, New York, New Jersey. So that to me was a privilege that I have of keeping my identity because I had the ability to live in two spaces and have to gain that second identity of being, a Latina in another country. But I definitely see that in the next generation, right? My children, my sons, and particularly my nieces who happen to live away from that environment, and how they find that identity through, growing up and kind of disassociating and then kind of realizing, and I have that interesting conversation with them. So that's why I don't really have, I've always lived in both, navigated both identities. When I went away to college, although I didn't go very far, I felt myself more explaining and in explaining one reflexes and reflects in things and puts things in order. But thankfully, I've always been very close to my identity as a Latina, and but I do see now how I'm blessed in that way.
Yeah, Jacqueline, if I may follow up with you, and this is not that speaking Spanish is so germane to being Latino, but do your kids speak Spanish?
Yes, they,
Okay.
but most of my family that grew up here speak Spanish, but we lived abroad in Latin America for many years.
Okay.
And they speak Spanish as a result of that. I would have made it my business as much as I could have, because we didn't live in New York City. It was difficult. It was really difficult. We lived in the Midwest for a long time, and then we decided to move to Latin America. But it is a struggle. It's not easy. I feel for parents, because other people tend to judge and say, how could you let them? It's really easy when you're in the East Coast, or when you're in an area that supports that. But that's, but definitely the identity comes with that. But I find that it's not the only one, and that more and more it's becoming a less hierarchy, that there are people identifying even when they don't speak the language through other means.
I know that growing up, my father died when I was very young, when I was 4 years old. So, and my mother's actually, my mother was born here. So I was close to my aunts and uncles on my father's side, but I never heard them speak Spanish until I was well into my 20s. And they did not speak with a Spanish accent. Oftentimes, Black people from Honduras are, because of they are, for the most part, come from the Caribbean to Honduras, tend to be more Caribbean than, well, more Black Caribbean than Spanish Caribbean. We're all Caribbeans. But yeah, so it wasn't like held up in our homes to speak Spanish. I mean, the food was like this mix, and I can clearly tell just, from the food that, they had that culture from Honduras, but looking for the language, or at least speaking the language wasn't really there. Although they did speak it privately amongst themselves, but never when there were people in the room who may not speak Spanish.
Yeah, that's a really interesting, I see that in my students. I have a lot of Panamanian descent students, and their parents don't speak Spanish to them. But I also lived in Panama, and I know for a fact that there's a region of West Indian descent, Caribbean descent, that went to Panama as a result of the Panama Canal. And although it's been years, their elders still speak English, and some of them teach, the younger ones to speak English. So if they migrate here, it's very easy to just switch.
Right.
And I've never really met Panamanians before I lived in Panama. And I was really surprised. And there's a region where they completely speak English. The whole reggaeton thing comes from there. Yeah. And that whole society. But then coming here to teach, once I have meetings with the parents is when I realize, because they also have English sounding last names, just in conversation with them and later, and also sometimes with how strict they are or how different they then you realize that they're Panamanians. But yeah, that happens a lot, and that was kind of new to me. Difference in Honduras is kind of the same thing, and Costa Rica also has a diaspora like that you don't really know. And once they comes here, I think for some it's easier to just switch and just adapt to that, and then the next generation doesn't necessarily learn the language, and that's not unique to those countries, of course.
Well, thank you for that insight. Hi, everyone. I'm Argie.
Hey, Argie.
Hi, Argie.
I think I'm in most of you, but good to see everybody tonight. Something interesting happened in my lifetime. I was born and raised here in the United States. My parents are from the Caribbean. My father's from Puerto Rico. My mother's from the Dominican Republic. I guess that was considered intercultural. But here in the United States, I have to admit that Latina and Hispanic, unfortunately, our dear country does have a double standard, okay? There is a racial situation that happens here in the United States. I don't think it's a language issue, okay? And I'm saying this because let me give you an example. I remember as a little child, one time a teacher came to our class and she was supposed to be speaking Spanish to the so-called Hispanic kids, okay? Any kid that was too dark got passed by, okay? I remember even calling out my name, Argelia. The teacher never called out Argelia, it was always Angela. Angela, did you misspell your name? Okay, you see what I'm saying? I'm sure if that would have been a Black or Hispanic teacher, she would have been fired for that. Okay, I remember as a little 5-year-old child, when you go to the library and you gotta know how to write your name to get that library card. In my day and age, it was like that. And that was a big deal. And then when you came home, it was like a little celebration. Oh, she wrote her name by herself. She was, I was a 5-year-old kid when I learned how to write because my older brothers and sisters taught me. And I'm never gonna forget the librarian saying to me, Angela, did you misspell your name? And I remember my sister telling her, you're a librarian and you don't know how to read. I'm gonna tell my mother on you. Little things like that, because in the Dominican, in these countries, during the Latin countries, I noticed from visiting them, not a racial issue. There is a class division. There's an upper class, a lower class, okay? And then I noticed that I spoke better Spanish than many of those white looking kids in class. Okay, I couldn't understand why were they chosen to converse in Spanish and not us. What happened? Our skin was not white enough. So we can't be, and my mother, like all the other moms, watched the novelas. You know, how many of us Hispanics who grew up, you know, the good old novelas? Those are like the Spanish soap operas of the evening.
Yes.
And that was back then, where they could see, but I never saw an actor or an actress with a certain skin complexion. Okay, if they were like Ron, if they were like your complexion, they were going to be like the maid or the servants. Okay, but in none of these novelas, of course they spoke Spanish. That's why our mothers watched them, because they were in Spanish. Okay, these were the Spanish channels. El canal 47, you know, and the good old si es Goya, tiene que ser bueno. If it's Goya, it has to be good. But I never saw anybody in those Goya commercials who looked too ethnic. Okay, so later on, of course, when I got to college and I took African American studies for the first time in my life and bumped into who Arturo Schomburg was, and had to take myself to the Schomburg Library, because anytime my parents spoke about our culture or anything about why am I Latina, it always had to first be about Spain. Okay, we didn't talk about the Taínos or the Aztecs or the Mayans. That didn't exist. Okay, it first started, well, we are people, so because we have roots from Spain, we're supposed to be so-called elitist good people. That was like how that went. But then I bumped into people like Arturo Schomburg, who said, just a minute, what is the rest of our Latino Hispanic culture about? Okay, there is more to this than just the European so-called central. And again, all those people from Spain, none of them look like you and I. Okay, so being born and raised here in this country, I spoke perfect Spanish all my life because my mother was a person that was not going to speak English in that day and age. She was like, you were the one that's American. You're the one who's born and raised here. You're the ones that have to learn English, not me. Not me, okay? That was her attitude about it, okay? But I even remember then with the language thing in school, if you spoke Spanish, you were punished. It was a crime at one point to even speak Spanish in school. I remember that very well. And remember, I went to one of those Catholic schools where the nuns were all European. But that's another interesting thing. None of those nuns looked like you either. Okay? And they were not going to relate to anything that was ethnic. Anything of ethnicity was not going to get related to. Okay? So, yeah, they came to, like I said, one day, somebody came to class to speak Spanish with the so-called Spanish kids. But anybody who was not light enough did not get chosen to be part of that Spanish conversation.
Wow.
Okay?
Yeah.
And I remember, but I remember one day a group of people coming to class and they spoke Spanish. It was a special group of people who were visiting us. And they said they were from Spain. And I went home and told, you know what I went home and told my mother? I said, Mom, there are white people that came to visit us today and they know how to speak Spanish very well. Okay, so that is what that Latina thing, and here in the United States, in the island, they don't do this. But I don't know what happens to people when they come to this country, that they just go crazy. If you look a certain way, or if you are a certain, you're not really supposed to be Hispanic or Latino until you could reach out to them, okay? Like when they're stuck. And now here you are, a bilingual person who speaks 100% fluent English and 100% fluent Spanish. They need your help badly. That's the only time they were going to relate to you, when they could get something out of you. Okay, yeah. That's because I guess language is powerful in that sense. Okay, but that was my concept about, and it was people like Arturo Schomburg and people like that. I had to go to the library on my own, because the school system was never going to teach you in this country what Latino or Hispanic is really about. And that's just my opinion about it. Okay, thank you everyone for listening to me.
That's all right. We need that, we need those perspectives when it comes to, how we shape the idea of what it means to be Latino or Latina in this country, and how we navigate two things. One, and as far as it relates to this book, how we look back at it historically, and how our parents had to deal with their own identity, how that identity shaped us, and then how we move forward, building on what our ancestors have laid out for us.
Does anyone else want to chime in before I introduce another theme? Ms. Heidi?
This is Ida. I just wanted to share that I thought the becoming word was interesting, right? How I became Latina, as if it invites the question, well, what were you before, right? And I also thought it was interesting to start with the conversation about race. As she dives into the whole DNA, right, journey, because she's really looking at like, okay, I'm gonna nail down this story, but it's gonna be rooted in DNA. So in some ways, like you can't argue that, because it's just, it's data that is. And so I thought it was curious because, if we look back at, the roots, like if, in my case, it's Puerto Rican roots, but in Puerto Rico, there were Taínos, the indigenous folks of Puerto Rico, native to the island, right, who get decimated by the Spaniards, who came in and raped, right, and then they bring in enslaved Africans to replace the indigenous people that they had killed, except for the ones that were able to escape into the mountains. And so it's like, well, I'm sure, the Taínos didn't call themselves Latinos.
Right.
And I'm sure the West Africans that were brought over didn't call themselves Latinos. So there's something about a story, right, of the mixture of all of these groups, namely the indigenous folks and our African ancestors, and then the Spanish conquistadors, right, which explain my light complexion. I tell people all the time, they're like, oh, you know, look at you. And I'm like, yeah, my grandmothers were raped. That's why I have this complexion. So let's be about what produced this, right? Had that colonization not happened, I would have looked very different. So I think the whole becoming Latina is very interesting because it really is about the intersection of all of those groups, right? Whether by force, which was the case for the colonizers, and then, over the centuries, in terms of how we have become this thing that is called Latino, which is now, sort of a word that is also very disputed, because some people are now saying it's Latinx, and then other people are saying it's Latina. And so, that's a whole other conversation. But I just thought the title itself was very packed, and sort of she doesn't shy away in the first chapter to just like go in.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. All of that. And the title does really point out the question, what were you before? And we'll get into that a little more. Does anyone else want to share before I chime in on a different theme? For anyone that just joined, we're just sharing brief personal stories that relate to the title, how I became Latina.
I just agree. This is great. And I just want to say that when I first moved to this country, New York City, I'm in Springfield now, but when I first moved, I went to New York. And to me, I was Dominican, but when I came here, I was Black and I was Puerto Rican. I was everything else. So yes, the Latina came after coming here.
Fascinating.
Agree.
Absolutely fascinating.
Agree. How did you feel about that?
Well, I was outraged when I first came. I was like in shock, and I had a story that I always tell, that I was in a bus. I took a bus everywhere and I walked everywhere, and I got into a bus and there was this white lady and there's a few Black kids in the bus, high schoolers talking, and the woman crushed her purse, and I was like, what? And when the kids were like talking loud, being teenagers, and I was like petrified. I was sitting in the bus and I was so like, what does this mean? Who are these people? What is this? I felt so oppressed that I was thinking, oh my God, how can Black people and other people have kids here if they're going to go through this? But then as I analyzed things, and I said, I feel so sorry for that woman, that she is so, damaged by the racism, that she is so uncomfortable in front of two kids, and so I had mixed thoughts and feelings, and started to understand more about how they saw me here in this country, and digging into my family and a lot of Dominicans. internalized racism.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That was really great, actually. Does anyone else want to chime in? No pressure. These are some great personal stories to kind of start us off tonight. And you know, just to introduce this theme of identity, which is what this book is about, what this memoir is about. And it is heavily focused on race and New York City and hip hop and DR. However, there's one chapter that isn't focused on any of that. Are him that he's not gay, right? So it's this idea, it's kind of like, and that sets us up, that really sets the stage for this book, because it's not so much who you are, but it's this really deep focus on who you are not. You know what I'm saying? I don't know if I've ever heard of that. A father taking a son to these different brothels to I don't know, sex the gay out of them. Like I didn't.
That's common.
That's common. Yeah,
That's common.
Yeah, that's common. A lot of boys, that's how they have their first sexual experience. I wouldn't say the majority, but that's not unusual. Yeah.
Yeah, unfortunately, it is common.
Yeah. That's insane. And it was really uncomfortable to read it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I was uncomfortable reading it.
But it also defines men's roles and women's, at least the expectation of roles, that it's all right for men to sort of come in, regardless of whether they are heterosexual or homosexual. The whole idea of, sex around manhood and there being this, now we call it sex workers and economy to kind of satisfy, that machismo is interesting and still exists,
Mm-hmm. So that kind of sets us up, right? This book is about identity, not finding who you are, but just solidifying who you are not. You are not gay, and I'm going to prove it by taking you to these brothels, And maybe this was just me. Maybe this was just my interpretation of the book, but there was this idea that identity and violence really almost performative violence, habitual and consistent violence.
Yes.
Were kind of interlinked. Was that just me, or was this a very violent few first chapters? There was the beatings at home, not only with the mom. And I'm thinking once she gets out of the picture, the beatings will stop, and then this will be like more of a happy coming of age story. But then it continues when she's not even with the mom. There's a line on page 25 that says, "Love will kill you in the end." And I really think that's a great line that really represents these first 72 pages. There's not a lot of love, but there's a lot of talk of like, oh my God, he's going to kill me. They're going to kill me. He's going to throw me out the window. It's almost as if the author was struggling with more sadness than she was identity.
Yeah. But maybe she is trying to frame her identity coming out of that, that violence, that sort of the randomness of it, it felt to me like she was, even though, you know, of course she's talking about her family, she's making a larger statement about what it meant to be either Latino or Dominican. Not that violence is inherent to being that way, but it is accepted as part of, you know, the way things are, in the same way in the book we read, When I Was Puerto Rican, it was accepted that the men, you know, would kind of step out on their wives. And she's kind of defined, Raquel Cepeda, in, I guess, her building the narrative, is kind of forming it that way. Like earlier on in the book, she also references how all Dominican men are ruby roses. Forgive me for butchering that word.
Rubirosa.
Right.
He was a playboy.
Yeah, like all men are, like, you know, all Dominican men are playboys. So, you know, that's kind of, once you set that path, you know, as far as how you're describing all men, it just feels like then you have to accept the brothel, then you have to accept the violence, because men have a certain, you know, hierarchy in the culture, and it's accepted.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many ways to, like, you know, have that conversation, right? But in a previous career, I had done a study in the Dominican Republic of women. And one of the things that they described, right? And so this is sort of like, I don't know, I want to say like maybe 10, 15 years ago, but you know, they would talk, it was like focus groups. So I would interview them, and they would like, they have headaches, you know, they all have headaches. Like but it was really stress, right? That would manifest in these headaches. And then when we dug deeper, it was like, okay, what is the stress about? And the stress was that in a lot of the cases, they were on the island, and then their significant other was in New York or in the States. And then typically what was happening was that they would have a family over here, and then they would have like the wife in the DR, you know? So, and there was just this, well, you know, what is our alternative here? Like, we're here, right? Let's look at the economy, you know, let's look at our education, let's look at our reality. And it was like, in many instances, they weren't in a position where they could, you know, challenge that because of, you know, their family situation, their economic reality, etc. Like, that was how they were getting money and living and surviving. And so, but it was horrible for them, because they knew that their husband had this whole other family over here. Maybe he'd come down and visit and, you know, throw some money that way, but it was not the healthiest of relationships. So I think the violence, though, you know, we talk about it in many ways in terms of like physical violence, but there were other forms of violence, of, you know, having different families, or, you know, financial violence, or just, it would take the form in many ways. The other thing I did while I was in the DR was work around sexual violence of children, but it was really fueled by tourism. So you have these tourism that want to go to the DR, tourists who want to go to the DR to have sex with children. And so at the height of the program, I had over 100 kids that have been rescued. And you know, and it was really hard work, because in some instances, the government would turn a blind eye to this stuff, right? And we're talking about like 10, 11, 12-year-olds that have a second kid, So I think, you know, it's all like tied to like the history, right? Patriarchy, colonization, government, right? What's driving and fueling the economy, and then how that impacts, you know, the lives of women and children on the island and in other places, you know, because then it's like, how do you root that out? So super, super difficult reality for a lot of women. And not just in the DR, like this is in other places too, right? It's not unique. It's not like all Dominican men. It's the patriarchy, right? And whoever signs on to like male domination.
Yes, thank you for all of that. And that must have been really, really trying work that you were doing. And I know sometimes when you're doing difficult work like that, you almost have to like cleanse from it. It's like, even though you didn't have anything to do with it, or the circumstances that created those environments, sometimes you have, when you're in it, you can find yourself immersed in it and not even realize.
I think, I was going to say that I think also we have to look at the history of these situations. Go ahead, Ron. Oh, I thought Ron wanted to. And remember that, for example, Trujillo, that's part of what overthrew him. Okay, if you ever watched that movie, In the Time of the Butterflies, La Tres Hermanas Mirabel, okay, and what happened to them, and he didn't expect them to retaliate against that. But I understand that that was very common among him, and he would take these young girls and carry on with them. And in the time of Trujillo, I'll tell you one thing, you said one thing against him, the next morning that military was going to be at your house, and he was good for disappearing you, and that was going to be the end of you. Okay, so, but I also looked at the American culture also, and I thought about, look, the madam services are very well known here in the United States, and those madam services are about that. You've got these, and these are people who are considered to be of the upper class level of society. These are executives who pay $10,000, $20,000 a night for a girl to introduce their 18-year-old sons to what an intimate relationship should be about. Okay, that's how they celebrate their sons' 18-year-old birthdays. Okay, that's what those madam services are all about. There was even a movie one time that was made of that. So it's actually very common, I think, just about every culture. Okay, again, now going back to the Latino culture, even within the religious perspective. Oh yes, most Latinos, because of that colonialism that took place from Spain, come from a Roman Catholic background. Because religion, interesting enough, becomes part of the culture. Look at that scandal, that sexual abuse situation going on. Well, I'm not even gonna go into that, but that's a whole book all by itself, okay? But it's very common ground in being an altar boy is supposed to be something good. Okay, and most Latinos like to send their kids to a Catholic school system because that's part of that colonial mentality from back home. Okay, but nobody ever thought twice of what's actually happening to their children. Okay, and if the priest was doing that to you, or the nun, even they abuse kids too. Okay, then you just dealt with it and you kept quiet about it. Okay, so we have to look at all the aspects of the fact that I think that's actually part of just about every culture, unfortunately.
Oh, it definitely is. Yeah, I don't think anyone was saying that it's just Latino culture. I think most certainly, like every culture, everywhere, most likely.
Wherever there are men.
You know, I do want to point out something that Grace said earlier about, because I mean, maybe it was just me, but I didn't feel like we really got into why Papi had so much self-hatred. There's that scene where they're walking down the street. She's already left Papito. I think it's like on page 46, 47 in the real actual book. She's already left Papito. Young Raquel is living back in New York with her dad, and then walking down the street, and he says something like, I wish they would take all of those Dominicans and kill them. That's a big thing to say. And then, but there's nothing else, like there's no real rhyme or reason as to why he feels this way. He goes on to like say things to her like, oh my God, you're just gonna be like all those other Dominicans on welfare with like a bunch of kids. But we never get why is he like that? Or at least it's never, I don't really see it like on the page. Am I the only one that feels like that? There's a lot of self-hatred, but there's really no rhyme or reason to any of it.
Yes, I believe a lot of us denied all that stuff that we learned in our history. We were not taught. We were taught to deny our African roots, and I believe that our Taino roots were exterminated, which is not true. We bring that in, and I think a lot of people don't want to address that.
Which makes it even, I mean, it's irrational. The whole, like her father's entire kind of outlook on life seems irrational. But so far we don't really have any type of reason or any type of story as to where it comes from, like where it was born from. And maybe that's the idea from they are by nature, right, irrational. So there's nothing to really concretely say where it came from. One thing I do think is really interesting is how she's gone through, like, seeing all of this violence. She did not have a happy childhood. She doesn't seem like a happy kid. And then she, like, what happens for a lot of people who did not have great childhoods, what happens? She finds hip hop. And she's like on the cusp of it, right? She's like right when hip hop is right being played on the radio, Grandmaster Flash, and like, that's that. I think she was like 10 or 11. So she was like right in the crux of it. And it seems to, in some parts, save her life, you know? And she's in New York City. So she's kind of like, even though she's witnessing all of this abuse and all of this heartbreak and neglect, it seems like once she finds rap, once she finds hip hop, that whole culture, like those are the points for the book to me where it kind of like comes alive. Like it's like a really enjoyable read. Did anyone else feel that way? Like the times when she's talking about finding hip hop, the times when she's talking about watching the B-boys.
I felt that way too. Yeah, I agree with you there. I felt that way also. I think she was able to kind of identify with herself through that hip hop. And I kind of felt that same way too. But it reminded me of situations like, you know, the history of Celia Cruz. And the Cuban community was not going to accept her. So she started her career over in Harlem at the Cotton Club. And then her and Tito Puente got together, okay? And she had to start her own band and her own musical company because none of the other Latino groups in the United States were acceptable of her. But then she was able to identify more with a cultural aspect of music so when this author talks about the hip hop and how I think she did identify with that very strongly for personal reasons, I think. Okay, and that was one parallel that I was able to make. Okay, Celia Cruz was not accepted by her Cuban community when she first came to the United States. Okay, and none of these clubs or places accepted her kind of music. Again,
yeah.
I guess, you know?
Yeah, for sure. Does anyone else kind of like remember, maybe Ron, maybe Lasaya, do you remember like this time period she's talking about? Can you share with us some scenes of life during that time?
You know, one of the things we don't equate with the early days of hip hop, one, I didn't know what was going on. Like, like when you look back on it now, it has such a structure in history, but when you're in the middle of it and it's just beginning, it doesn't have a name. Like, you know, from the very beginning, people weren't calling it hip hop. You were just going to block. The reason why it was so much fun, you were just going to block parties. That's the only thing, and there was a DJ. And what used to fascinate me, to tell you how long I've been a nerd, was that how the DJs would set up their equipment and plug into the lamppost. And I never knew, so the bottom of any lamppost, there are plugs. And that's how, you're not supposed to do it, it's illegal to do it, but that's how they ran their turntables. But you weren't sitting there thinking like, oh, this is a good hip hop jam, or this is a good, you know, rap party, anything like, it was just, what made it so accessible to like somebody like Raquel is it was everywhere. You know, it was in every block. Every school has a big schoolyard, at least they used to. And in those schoolyards is where most of the jams happen. It wasn't the same structure that you have now, you know, where everything has a ticket and you gotta, you know, you can only buy your tickets at a certain time if you want to see this person, that. And I know they're still underground. I know it's still open if you're young enough to sort of know where things are happening. But what gave people like Raquel access is that it didn't have this kind of structure. You know, it probably didn't even have a name that we call hip hop now, or rap, or, you know, whatever. It was just like, it was a party. And that party was completely open to the public. That's how I always remember them. No structure, anything like that. And of course, there was this undercurrent of crime, because this was the 70s, probably the 80s for Raquel, but like, you know, early on, it was just like stuff that was happening in the neighborhood.
Yeah, I think it was 81 for her. But
Right,
that's
okay.
also when it was on the radio. So that would have been, you know,
Right,
2 years after it kind of
but even on the radio, it was only on the radio like late, you know, in 81. It wasn't like at 5 o'clock. It was like these late, like 2 a.m. kind of shows. I don't know if Mr. Magic was on or Red Alert. That might have been their very early days. And, you know, they came on late.
So that's, you know, that's one thing also that, oh, I'm sorry.
No, hi, how are you? It's
Hey,
Brenda.
Brenda.
What I was gonna say is one of the instrumental pieces back then was having public access TV, where you were able to see video music box.
Right.
And that also gave you access to what was happening in your neighborhood, what was happening in your school, what was the latest kicks, the latest fashion. You got to see it on TV, and then you could emulate it, because not everybody was buying magazines at that time, but some were.
Or
you
had
know,
cable. Most people
or had
didn't
cable.
have cable.
Right.
Only
So
Manhattan
you were
had
able.
cable.
Exactly. So you wanted to see that, and that's why it became famous, the whole shout out. You know, let me give a shout out. And that was from Video Music Box, because everyone would be like, who do you want to give a shout out to? And it'd be like, well, I want to give a shout out to my mother and my cousin. And that's where it became very famous, from Video Music Box, Ralph McDaniels. You know, and it continued, and you wanted to be seen. So you wanted to be wherever he was, whatever block party, whatever event, with the flyest clothing and kicks. So that way, you know, you can be invited again to the next jam, because you hot.
Yeah. No, it's so, and she talks about the coat, we'll get to that, but it's like, you know, that idea that like hip hop, this like this like Black American culture, the Black American music is truly for everybody. It has a way of bridging, as Jacqueline says, bridging cultures like no other music has ever done, or at least that we've seen. Nothing has ever bridged it. Nothing has ever brought so many people together like hip hop truly, truly has.
Yeah,
and I
and back
think
then there wasn't even the MTV. I think started 81.
Right.
I think it was MTV, and
I
it
don't
was
even think
only
they
like
could play hip hop. I think they had a
no, there was
they
no hip
didn't.
hop. It was Michael Jackson. It was more like Duran Duran. It was
Right.
like European bands. It was like the Go-Go's, those type of bands that we would listen to if you listen to that. If not, you listen to BLS.
Michael,
But yeah.
Michael Jackson had to threaten MTV to get them to play
yeah,
and Michael Jackson was huge,
right,
by this time,
right.
but they didn't even want to play Michael Jackson. And their Michael Jackson's record company had to threaten MTV or they would pull all their videos. But this is a book, I've had this book for a while. It's called And It Don't Stop. This is the book that Raquel Cepeda edited on hip hop. And it's just a book of essays, 25 essays on hip hop. So actually it's, And It Don't Stop, the best American hip hop journalism of the last 25 years. So she's really been in it for, for a minute.
You can tell that it really saved her from whatever whatever it did for her, it stuck with her, and this is the thing. Like I remember like, and I grew up in the suburbs, and I remember in 2006 when Ghostface Killer came out with Fish Scale, I hadn't heard anything. My whole life changed. I had never heard anyone use words like that. Like the cadence was I think I had elevated in life. Like after that, I heard that album. Like I needed more of it. It was an addiction, Hip hop does that for you, So it is nice. It's so rewarding to read when she writes about hip hop, because so much of the rest of the pages are quite sad. Does anyone else feel like that? It's kind of like she doesn't,
in a way, I feel like we're viewing her transition. We're probably getting, because it says how she became Latina. So that's probably when she has to make sense of it. And at the beginning, all we're seeing is the violence, the pain, and then at some point, I feel like she's going to take us through an understanding of how, just like we're questioning, because I feel the same way you do, like where does all this anger come from? Like there isn't really a source. And I'm thinking that we're going to journey with her, and it's going to, through the whole DNA thing and the fact that she starts with a historian, just Gossett, I feel like she's giving us the preamble of what it seems like to her. Maybe at that point, it's just her perspective is just all this violence, and it is violent, but it's going to kind of take us on the journey of how of becoming and understanding her identity, and maybe knowing where all this anger or that's kind of what I'm anticipating.
Yeah, I hope so. Because without any explanation, it makes it a little difficult to read for me. It's so at the end, towards the end of the pages, one of her friends asks her, like, I can't understand why you like all that Black shit. And she's like, what are you talking about? Like this is like, she's legitimately confused. And it's almost like what I've noticed, I'll tell you a very quick story. What I've noticed about, like, especially Latino or Latinx people from the Bronx, if no one's ever told them they're not Black, they're like, wait, what are you talking about? I am Black. I'll tell you a story of why I say that. I recently, well, in the past year, I've started helping, I became a doula. And so I started helping really young, like 17-year-old girls in the Bronx get pregnant. So I've started like helping them, you know, through the pregnancy, through the birth, labor, all that. And it's not easy. It's a very difficult job, but it's very rewarding at the end. So on Sunday, one of my clients goes into labor, right? And she's at Bronx, Lebanon. And one of the nurses comes and asks her, just like getting information for those wristbands they put on you when you go into the hospital. And, you know, she's young, she's 17. So, and she asks her like, okay, and where are you from? And she's like, I'm from the Bronx. And she says, and are you Black, Latino, or white? And she was just like, she looked like she was getting punked. You know, her face was just like, I mean, like she didn't understand. Like she genuinely was like, I'm Black, but I'm like Puerto Rican and Dominican, but I'm like it was a very eye-opening, when we're talking about identity, it was a very eye-opening like couple of moments, I think, for a few people in the room. So yeah, like identity, someone has to either tell you what you are or tell you what you're not. And if not, then I think you're kind of just your environment. You're kind of just what you get to grow up around. People are very lucky in that sense. People whose identity has never been beaten into them or beaten out of them, and they kind of just get to be. That's such a luxury. No matter where you are in the world.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, you know what I'm saying?
Yes. Very true.
But is that the case? Do you think that's the case for all Latinos? I mean, sometimes it feels like Latinos fight hard not to be grouped in with Black people.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're in denial of our, we're taught to hate it, to not want to be. The lighter you are, the more you look like the colonizers, the more privileges you have, and that's why you aspire to be.
You know, one thing I've noticed, hearing you say that, one thing I noticed is that, you know, I grew up in a beauty salon. My mom owned a hair salon my whole life. And one thing I've noticed about Dominicans is that their hair is extraordinarily coarse. And yeah, when you walk past some of the salons, some of the Dominican salons, a lot of them do blowouts. When you walk past them, there will be these stark white women, these posters of white women with like long wavy hair. And no one in that salon looks like that. Nowhere close to it, you know?
And
so
you're not gonna walk out of any Dominican salon, you will not have a curl left to your hair.
Yes, yes.
Your hair. Walk into a Dominican salon after they finish.
I've been into many.
Wait, first you got to sit under the hair dryer. Then they're gonna blow dry it out. Then they're gonna pass a hot comb through it too. Okay. And
yes.
I've had many a Dominican blowout, but the point I'm making is about the self-hatred, how there are white women outside.
Yes, exactly. And that's what I'm saying. It's incredible how much we internalize that, and then we don't even realize it.
But it's the same in every industry. Where, okay, if you go to a travel agent who is selling, you know, to travel to like Hispanic Caribbean countries or South America or Latin countries, how many of those people in those posters that they have look like Ron?
Nobody.
You know what I'm saying? So I think it happens in just about every avenue.
But you're saying like when you get there, most people look like Ron, is what you're saying.
Like me, but not when they're trying to sell it.
Yeah.
Right.
Not marketing material.
The ones who own the travel agency look like Ron, but none of the posters and even travel magazines they have around of the countries they go to or none of the advertisements they have around, none of those model, like let's say you want to go to a cruise liner in a Caribbean Spanish country, okay? How many of those people in those posters look like Ron?
Nobody.
Okay, so you're right. I agree with you. Now I know that among many immigrants that come here, not only Hispanics, but I have noticed that many of them, like for example, I know this Russian guy, he went as far as changing his last name to make it more Anglo-Saxon American. Okay, so there is a certain type of imperialism when people come to the United States. Okay, and you know what he told me? He said, I'm not going to teach my kids Russian. I want to make sure that they speak English because I want to make sure that his kids are born here. Okay, and I know a lot of, yes, Hispanics who feel that not teaching their kids how to speak Spanish is like a status American symbol. No, these kids are American and I don't want them to be hanging out. I know Hispanics who will not allow their children to play with other kids who speak Spanish.
It seems like her father was like that. There was a scene
Yeah.
where he caught her on the tennis court, and there was like an argument there. So it's such a source of, this is interesting because most books we've read, the race and identity are never such a source of contention like they are in this book. So it's refreshing in that sense, to kind of see a different side, but it's rather confusing, There's no like point of awakening, where we're like, oh, okay, that's why you behave like that. Or like, oh, okay, that's why they think like that. And maybe that is because there isn't one.
Yeah.
So
one example I can give you, like in the Dominican Republic, the three fathers of the country, Duarte, Sanchez, y Mella, they always put Duarte because he's lighter and they still make him look lighter. And all the kudos go to him when the other two, because they're darker, have lesser roles, even though the three of them have equal, in equal part in doing what they did, and even some more because they actually were on the front lines fighting for the country, while Duarte was just, writing down or whatever the plan, so that's how the internalized racism is so strong, and we're so blind to it. We don't want to admit it. We don't want to have any part of it. Families, I argue with my family all the time over that point because they're always saying racist thing about other people, and like, oh, I say, oh, you're so, where you come from? Oh, who is your grandmother? And they're always pointing out the family that you have that came from Spain or France or whatever. I said, well, what about your African grandmother?
I don't want to have that conversation.
And I think also the race conversation, you're like, why people don't identify as that and stuff. It's like, like I'm Black and I'm proud, that whole narrative in the United States and that whole movement, it didn't get played out in the same way in the Latino Caribbean countries, so there that attachment to, like, to say it and to stand in it boldly and proudly. It's not the same experience. There are other ways and other things that emerge that do give a positive narrative, right? But not in the same way that in the US. So as folks have described, right, you're rewarded the closer you are to whether you look that way or talk that way or act that way to the dominant culture, you know, in this case being whoever the colonizer is. And so it's more a survival mechanism, right? Because that's how you're going to get the job. That's how you're going to get love in the family. That's how you're going to get the mate. So, I think it's important to sort of contextualize it more, understanding that it's not like all the American experience, that in our Caribbean and Latin American countries, that got, race gets played out differently, definitely informed by colonizers and, the oppressors, but definitely not in the same way.
Yeah, and I think that's why in the book, she doesn't really talk about race at all when she's talking about DR. It's kind of just like paradise to her. Granted, she's much younger, but it doesn't seem to be this tension like it is when she gets to the States. And maybe that's also because her stepfather was Haitian, right? He was a Haitian man that she met here, that her mom met here in America. So I think that's probably why in the book we don't get to race until we get to America, because that's when her father, we get to meet more about her father and his attitude towards Dominicans, even though he's Dominican. And we all know self-hating people. So I don't know why her father shocks me so much, but and not only just self-hating Dominicans, I've met self-hating all types of folk, but it's like she said, she does mention one thing where she says, I don't know why my father is the way he is. He's never had to take the subway before. So it's not like he's ever been mugged or been robbed. Like, he drives to his job in the Bronx, So it was kind of like, where is the source? Where is the source for the threat coming from? Where's the source for the self-hatred coming from?
The young lady that just spoke, I think it was Haiti, she was speaking, I was thinking about when I was growing up, that in school, you learned Black History Month, about the ancestors, but throughout the year, whenever you talked about your background, Christopher Columbus was glorified. So we all have that attachment to Christopher Columbus. If you're, 40 plus, 50 plus, if you grew up in the islands, you had island pride. You loved your island, even though in the same family, you had that back and forth of light skin and dark skin, but then you came together because you love your island, and then once you leave your island, you come here and you're trying to figure out where do I belong? Where am I placed? You don't have the island, you have New York Island at this point, So now you're trying to figure out, where do I fit in? Light, dark, is it Christopher Columbus? Now they're telling me, no, it's the Indians and it's the Africans. So I think the kids now, and I'm speaking because of my daughter's 15, they have a more of a connection to our ancestors, the African part of it, because we're teaching them natural hair and beauty, comes from all areas. But for me, growing up, that conversation was never had the way that is being had now, So for me, I always, like I said, went to the Dominican spot, got my hair straightened. The natural thing was always like, girl, what you gonna do with that hair? You ain't going outside like that, and it was everything to take that away from what you knew. I think now it's more embraced.
Yeah, and you know why? One reason I think that is because that is a really excellent point. And I will say that one reason, possibly, I think that is because, with all of that, right? With all of that straightening, with all of the flat ironing, the perms, with all of the skin bleaching, with all of the self-hatred, that still did not make the white man love any Black person anymore, or any Latino person anymore. So it's like, I think we kind of realized that no matter how hard you try, no matter how much tap dancing you do, you will never, it's completely worthless. It will get you nowhere with with your precious white people. And I think that's one thing that I feel like we've shaken out of this this desperate need, not just Black people, not just Latino people, but really anyone who's not white. I feel like we're all kind of shaking out of that desperate need to please the white man. I feel like we're not really doing that so much like in the past as how we used to. Don't go outside with your hair looking like that. Make sure you are behaving, code switching and behaving in a certain way.
There's more pride around being Black now, just being who you are as a Black person now than probably in any time in the history of this country. I mean, even like civil rights, post-civil rights, you know, the majority of Black people did not participate in the civil rights movement in any kind of way. You know, we like to think there was like this big movement, but it was actually, the civil rights movement was like a really small movement, you know, as far as like percentage of the country. And I think one of the things that's changing that now is social media, the fact that, you know, everyone has a television in their pocket. You know, if you have your cell phone, you have a TV with you. So there are all these relentless images now we see of Blackness. And to be cool in this country is to adopt things that come from Black culture. Whether it is the music, the clothes, just the, you know, overall style, that's the cool currency is Blackness now, you know. Like nobody wants to be Polish and cool, not knocking Polish people, but you know, people want to, you know, if you look at for coolness, you're looking towards Black people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always been. I think that's before cell phones. And I think we get it a lot, Ron, in this book. I think we get it a lot.
It's pushed at us relentlessly now, you know, because of access to media that we all have. It's funny, when I first went to the South in the 70s, they had a completely different way of dressing. They were country, like they walked barefoot. I'm the only person wearing sneakers down there. It was just a completely, you know, but now the whole country looks the same. You know, people on the East Coast look like people on the West Coast. The South looks like the Midwest. And, you know, everyone looks like Kanye West, or everyone looks like, you know, Jay-Z or Rihanna, or whoever, you know. But there was a time when there were stark differences because we didn't have like this sort of universal access to media, that, you know, those sort of regional styles were like really, you know, hard and fast.
I mean, it's been adopted because it's non-threatening. So, you know, they stood back and watched, and since they feel safe with it, they've adapted it.
Yeah, now they've co-opted it, you know, now they own it. They own our style and culture. They being the sneaker companies, the clothing companies, you know, they bought it through paying celebrities and athletes and musicians, you know, so. But I'm not mad. I'm not mad. More power.
I'm not upset either, but I will say, reading this book, a very small part of me thought, I guess I always feel some sort of policing over Black culture. And so when I'm reading this book, I'm like, this is so crazy that this woman is falling in love with hip hop and got a racist daddy. You know, like, I'm like, I feel a little sensitive towards things like that sometimes. They're a bit triggering for me sometimes.
Yeah,
'Cause
I feel like I grieve that. It's like I feel some kind of sadness.
yeah, because it's almost like she has to run to the opposite of her father. That abuse is so heavy that to feel anything that isn't that, she almost has to, she runs to the opposite of her father,
Mhm.
which is freedom, the freedom of hip hop, the blackness of hip hop, the
Yeah.
rhythm of hip hop, you know, the safeness at that time for sure.
No, absolutely.
We got about 5 minutes left. Does anyone want to bring up anything that we haven't discussed yet?
I want to just share that the conversation of hip hop I think is really interesting, because one thing and you know, I'm in my late 50s now, but one thing that I do remember very clearly about that era from hip hop in my generation was that it was very Black and Latino, you know? So there's this whole music genre of like freestyle and hip hop musicians and stuff that was all Black and Latino youth from the
Mhm.
streets that created clothing and language and music, and the it wasn't as polarized as it is now, you know, like I don't remember the way the conversation is now, that it was so polarized back then, like you were either this or that,
Right.
you know what I'm saying, like you have to check one box,
Yeah.
and it just wasn't like that. And I think for the you know, one of the things around the Latino experience, and I know this to be true about the Dominican experience, but I'm Puerto Rican, other Dominicans can speak to it, is that you could have that family that has the rainbow. You know what I'm saying? And you're all under one roof. And so, you know, it's, to me, this book is about, yes, the racial thing, but it's the intersectionality too of her experience as a Dominican woman. So let's bring in the gender lens too. And what does it mean? Not to be Dominican only, but to be a Dominican woman, Dominican girl growing up in another country that's not your country of origin, that your families are immigrants, that they don't speak the language. You know what I'm saying? They're like all these layers, so many layers, that you're living in this community, that, you know, you came from this island where you could run around and be, you know, free, and now you're here like locked up in an apartment. Right, and somebody's throwing the kid off the roof across the street from you. Like, there is something about that whole trajectory about not being in your country of origin, and it's all our experiences, right? Because we're all products of history, and history has taken us and torn us from where we're from. So I think the hip hop conversation is really interesting, and I didn't get to read, you know, the whole thing, but you know, we'll see how it unfolds.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. It is interesting though about not being in the country of your origin and then moving somewhere. Those are kind of like two different conversations, right? There is a different conversation between being kidnapped from somewhere and taken somewhere else and buying a plane ticket and moving somewhere, right? That is a different conversation. And I did not find, I'm a skilled researcher, I did not find any evidence that that story she told was true about the baby being thrown off the roof. It would have been in the New York Times. It would have been somewhere. I did not find a shred of evidence. I only looked for about 30 minutes, but I just want to say that I would have found the article.
Yeah.
I did not find it.
You know, I used to, I never witnessed it, but I used to hear stories like that. And it is possible that a story like that would not have made the newspaper. You know,
The
Absolutely.
baby going off a roof in 1970.
Yes,
Yeah, no,
absolutely.
totally.
Because
This is not Michigan.
most of the buildings
This is
most
New
of the
York.
buildings were short buildings. A lot of the buildings were 6 stories, and you could go from one building to the next, to the next, to the next. And a lot of people played up there, you know? So you started in one building, let's say your building was number 300, and your friend was in number 310. You didn't necessarily go outside of the building and walk in front of the building to get to him. If you lived on the 6th floor, you went right to the roof, crossed over, and your friend lived on the 5th floor, and you came down in his building. And nobody saw you. You got used to it. The doors were open. You knew how to open it. He'd open it on his building, and you'd cross over. So a lot of kids, teenagers fell, you know, because they played up there. You know, and of course, when they wanted to actually commit a crime, they would throw people off of there. You know, you know,
This is also
definitely.
I'm sorry, Brenda.
No, that it definitely wouldn't have made the paper all the time. I had a neighbor, she jumped off the 6th floor, and it didn't make the paper because it was so common.
Right.
You know, and that goes right hand in hand with redlining. So there was a lot that was omitted from paperwork, you know, redlining and stuff like that on the news. It goes hand in hand. All those fires that happened, a lot were not documented.
Yeah, the fires, I remember that.
Yeah, and if you look now, actually, that neighborhood she's talking about is completely gentrified. So maybe you're right. They just like erased all of that from history to get people to buy buildings.
Yeah.
Well, it was never documented, so they didn't even have to erase it. It was never documented.
Yeah,
you know,
it was a different New York back. I mean, now we have 300 murders, and you know, people are 400 murders, and people are crazy. Back then, we had upwards of 2,000 murders, you know, every year. So it was and definitely well over 1,000. I think it peaked at 2,000 in the early 90s. So it was a different time. But we're actually, it's actually 8:32.
Can I just add one thing? You can watch the documentary, The Bronx is Burning. If you watch that documentary, that gives you a whole lot of background.
Mention that.
And someone also posted The Rubble Kings, which was a documentary. So you can check that out also.
Right.
To learn
And
more.
Video Music Box's documentary, I think it's on Showtime.
Yes, it just came on, I think.
It just came out.
I think
So
it just came
Well,
out.
I'll have to watch that. I have Showtime now.
Yeah.
I think it's Showtime.
This was a really great conversation, y'all. I feel like these discussions are always so much more about the book. We always get a bit of history, especially New York history. So thank y'all so much for sharing. As usual, Ron, thanks for bringing us together. Do you want to have any last words?
Yeah, so next week we're going to discuss pages 73 to 136. And, you know, tell people that, you know, the subject, and, you know, just spread the word. We're trying to spread it on social media. And Raquel will be here in the conversation. I believe that's February 16th. She will be in the conversation. So, you know, by all means, we want a big turnout. You don't, you know, to have a conversation with Raquel, you don't have to have read the book. I mean, that's great, but she's such a well-known hip hop journalist. She has more to contribute to who we are, you know, those of us who kind of are from that era of the early hip hop days. So definitely tell people. We always like to have a good turnout when the author comes, and that's in 2 weeks.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you so much, everybody.